The morning of the hearing, the room smelled of beeswax candles and the particular damp cold that Georgian houses kept even in late spring. 3 solicitors' clerks occupied the far wall, their quills at rest, their attention directed at the arrangement of chairs around the long table, as though the placement of furniture might determine the day's outcome before anyone had spoken. Cecily Vane sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She had been saying nothing for the better part of 8 months, and she had found it a remarkably useful habit. The black crepe of her mourning dress fell in careful folds to the floor. The veil obscured her face, which was convenient this morning, because there was something beneath it that she had no intention of allowing Mr. Reginald Pemberton to see. Pemberton himself stood at the window with his hands behind his back, surveying the grounds of Crestfall Park as though they already belonged to him. He had the bearing of a man whose confidence has never been seriously tested, which is a specific and recognizable kind of confidence, the kind built on a foundation of other people's failures to object. He had laid out his challenge to the terms of Alistair Vane's will in careful legal language across 14 written pages, and he had not once addressed the challenge directly to Cecily. He had addressed it to the trustees. She was, in his estimation, a matter to be disposed of, rather than a party to be persuaded. Mrs. Dorothea Vane, Alistair's elder sister, sat at Pemberton's left with her hands arranged on the table, and her expression set in the lines of a woman performing grief for an audience of professional observers. She had never cared for Cecily. She had said so once, not to Cecily's face, but loudly enough that the sound had carried through a closed door, which Cecily thought reflected equally on the house's construction and on Dorothea's discretion. At the far end of the table, Mr. Edmund Farley, Earl of Westmere, stood at the window on the opposite side of the room from Pemberton. He was looking at the park, rather than at any of the people in it, which was his habitual arrangement whenever he did not wish to be observed observing someone. Cecily had noticed this about him in the weeks since his arrival. She suspected he did not know she had noticed. She let the veil conceal what she thought about that as well. Outside, a wood pigeon called twice and then went silent, which seemed to her like a reasonable editorial comment on the proceedings. The 8 months preceding that morning had begun in the manner of most unwelcome things, without announcement and without the decency of preparation. Alistair Vane had died on the 4th of September, quietly and without drama, which was consistent with the manner in which he had conducted the whole of his life. He had been 53 years old and had known for 2 of those years that the heart complaint diagnosed by his London physician would eventually resolve the question of his survival in a definitive direction. It was this foreknowledge that had produced, 18 months before his death, his proposal to Miss Cecily Hartley, the 3rd daughter of a clergyman in Gloucestershire, who had been 25 years old and possessed of a clear head, a modest education, and no money at all. The proposal had not been romantic. Alistair had not pretended otherwise, and Cecily had appreciated him for it. He had laid out the situation with the directness of a man who had always preferred clarity to comfort. He required a practical woman who could manage a household that he was no longer well enough to manage, who could serve as guardian to his young nephew Thomas, and who would in return receive the widow's dower rights in the estate, and a settled independence that a clergyman's daughter had no other means of acquiring. He had been kind. He had been honest. He had treated her intelligence as a convenience rather than a defect, which had distinguished him from every other man she had known. She had said yes, and she had meant the yes in the way that people mean a thing when they have understood it clearly and chosen it freely. She had not loved Alistair in the way the novels described love, which she had always suspected was more of the novel's problem than hers. She had respected him. She had cared for him in the 14 months of their marriage, with the thoroughness of someone who did not do anything by halves. When he died in September, she had grieved, quietly and privately. Not the romantic loss the world liked to perform, but the genuine loss of a person she had relied on and been relied upon by, which she thought the quieter and more accurate grief. The world, naturally, had formed its own view. To Reginald Pemberton and to most of the county, Cecily Vane was the clever little widow who had attached herself to a dying man for the advantage of his estate, and was now positioned to absorb a comfortable fortune that ought by rights to descend through blood. He had said this in those exact words, or nearly those words, in a private conversation with Dorothea in the library on the third evening after his arrival at Crestfall Park in January. He had not known that the library fireplace shared a flue with the small sitting room, or that Cecily had been in the small sitting room at the time with the window cracked open for the cold air that helped her think. She had not corrected his view. She had simply noted the words and filed them alongside everything else she was learning about what Pemberton intended, which was considerable. The trustees named in Alistair's will had been 3 in number, a retired colonel who had died the previous autumn, leaving only 2, and these 2 had arrived within a week of each other in January. Mr. Silas Morrow, the senior London solicitor who would render the formal legal judgment, was not a trustee, but an arbiter of last resort, Alistair's own precaution against exactly the sort of dispute that was now unfolding. He had come on a Tuesday, in weather that had turned the carriage road into a matter of negotiation between horse and mud, and he had arrived in the courtyard of Crestfall Park with his coat splashed to the collar and an expression on his face that told Cecily 2 things immediately. He disliked the situation, and he intended to deal with it responsibly, regardless. She had watched his arrival from the doorway because the housekeeper, Mrs. Petch, had developed a habit of alerting her to things worth seeing, and Mrs. Petch had appeared at the study door with the particular look that meant something was occurring. He had been taller than she expected, which was not a relevant observation, but her mind made it before she could direct it elsewhere. He had dark hair that the weather had done no favors, and gray eyes that moved through the courtyard with the thoroughness of someone cataloging details for later use. He had noticed her in the doorway in the same moment she noticed him noticing, and they had held each other's gaze for 3 seconds, which in the social arithmetic of the Regency was approximately 2.5 seconds longer than courtesy required, before he had inclined his head in a formal acknowledgement, and she had stepped back to allow him to be received. She had gone back to the estate accounts she had been revising, which was the appropriate response to the arrival of a trustee, and she had not thought about the 3 seconds again for nearly a week. Edmund Farley, Lord Westmere, had been Alistair's closest friend since their school days, which meant that he arrived at Crestfall Park with a private grief that he had no intention of displaying to anyone. His grief was not, in his view, relevant to the legal question at hand, and so he kept it in the same place he kept most of the things that mattered to him, which was somewhere behind the expression of careful courtesy he had been wearing as professional armor for the better part of 6 years. The armor had been fashioned, as all such armors are, around a specific wound. He did not think about it often, because thinking about it was not useful, and he was a man who preferred useful thinking to any other kind. But it was there, in the manner that old injuries are always there, a slight alteration in how one moves through a room where women with quick, precise minds are gathered, a small, studied distance, a reflexive evaluation of whether intelligence in a woman was being deployed toward something legitimate or toward him. He was not proud of this reflex. He was simply aware of it, the way one is aware of a door that has been latched shut for long enough that one forgets it was ever open. Lydia Croft had been 22 and had laughed at exactly the right moments, and had told him, across a fortnight of walks in her father's garden, that she found in him a mind that matched her own. She had then accepted the suit of a marquis 2 weeks after Edmund had declared himself, and he had understood afterward, with the particular coldness of retrospective clarity, that he had been useful to her as a means of making the Marquis jealous enough to move. The intelligence she had shown was not pretense. It had simply been aimed at something other than what she had implied. He had adjusted his understanding accordingly. Women who were clever were not, therefore, to be trusted, as he had trusted Lydia. They were to be watched and assessed for whom the cleverness was serving. He had arrived at Crestfall Park already disposed to find her suspicious. He was almost certain she was playing a game of some kind. He simply had not yet determined the nature or the object of it. He was correct that she was playing a game. He had miscalculated only the direction. It was on the 11th day of February, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, that Edmund discovered the accounts. He had come to the study to retrieve a document he had left the previous evening, a letter from Morrow that he needed to review before the household was awake and unavailable for interruption. The study was dim, the fire reduced to coals, the room cold enough that he could see his breath. The desk that Cecily used for the estate management was in the corner near the east window, and the drawer that she normally kept locked was standing open by perhaps 3 inches, which was the width of a detail that would not have registered with most people, but registered with Edmund because he noticed the displacement of ordinary things. He should have left the drawer as he found it, and retrieved his letter, and gone. He did not do that. He stood for a moment with his hand not quite touching the drawer's edge, aware of the quality of the silence in the room, which was the silence of a house that did not know it was being observed. Mrs. Petch's kitchen would be producing its first sounds in approximately an hour. Thomas would wake 2 hours after that and require breakfast and a Latin lesson and some form of outdoor activity, and the household would resume its ordinary character. In this particular interval, the room was entirely his, and the drawer was open by 3 inches, and he had spent his adult life noticing the displacement of ordinary things. He stood at the desk for perhaps 10 seconds before he understood what he was looking at. The accounts were in Cecily's handwriting, which he recognized from the correspondence she had shared with the trustees in January. They were organized by month, going back to the previous June, which was 3 months before Alistair's death. He had already known, in the abstract way one knows things one has been told, that she had managed the estate. He had not known the extent of it, which was total. Every expenditure, every income, every tenancy arrangement, every maintenance cost, the small economies she had identified and the larger ones she had deferred. The notation in August that the South Field drainage would require attention in spring. The careful column of figures indicating that the household debt Alistair had been slowly accumulating had been reduced by a specific amount in 6 months. He turned a page. He found the Bath accounts. They were dated in October, during the residency period that Pemberton was contesting, and they were unmistakable in their character. The estate expenses, recorded in Cecily's hand, from Bath. She had been carrying the accounts with her. She had been managing Crestfall Park from her dying father's bedside, from 130 miles away, which was the act of a woman who had never for a moment intended to abandon the estate or the ward or the responsibility she had been given. Edmund stood in the cold study for a long time, looking at the figures, and something in him that had been held at a studied distance for 11 days came loose from its moorings and drifted toward a different conclusion entirely. He had been wrong. Not about the cleverness, about its direction. A woman managing an estate from her dying father's bedside was not a woman scheming against the estate. She was a woman who had made a promise and intended to keep it, which was not the orientation toward other people's property that Pemberton's 14 pages implied. The accounts were not the record of a woman helping herself to what she could reach. They were the record of a woman who had not stopped working long enough to think about herself at all. He closed the drawer very carefully when he left. He was not certain she had left it open by accident. He was not certain she had not. The social temperature of Crestfall Park in the weeks that followed was regulated by the approach of Morrow's formal hearing, which had been set for the 15th of March and which Pemberton had been managing like a man laying out pieces on a chessboard, confident that he had counted all the pieces and found himself in possession of the majority. He had, in Cecily's assessment, accounted for most of the pieces correctly. He had simply not accounted for the one he considered already taken from the board. In the drawing room on the 6th of March, 9 days before the hearing, Dorothea Vane assembled the household for the particular kind of conversation that is conducted in the language of concern, while serving the purposes of warning. She spoke of Alastair's memory, and of the obligations of family, and of the difficulty of a young woman managing responsibilities that properly required the oversight of a man with experience of legal affairs. She did not address Cecily directly. She spoke to the middle distance in the way that women of her generation and station had perfected, a technique that delivered the wound while providing no surface against which it could be resisted. She said that she supposed Cecily had done her best, in the way that a clever little widow does her best, which is to say with great energy and rather less wisdom than either experience or proper guidance might have provided. The room said nothing. Mrs. Petch, who was present only because she had brought in the tea tray and remained on some quiet errand near the sideboard, did not visibly react, which was the reaction of a woman who had lived in service long enough to know when something important had been said that she might be asked to repeat later. Edmund was also present, standing near the window in his customary arrangement, and he did not speak. He was looking at his hands. Cecily was looking at Dorothea with the expression she had cultivated over 8 months of practice, which was composed and attentive and entirely opaque. She said, "Thank you, Dorothea," and nothing else, and then the subject changed, and she did not think about Dorothea's precise words again, because she had heard them and noted them and filed them where they belonged. That evening, late, when the house had gone quiet, and the candles in the drawing room had burned to their sockets, Edmund knocked at the study door. Cecily was not surprised. She had been expecting something, though she had not been entirely certain what form it would take. She set down her pen and said, "Come in." And he entered, and stood in the doorway without sitting, which she had already identified as his habit when he was uncertain of his welcome, and looked at her across the distance of the room. "I owe you an observation," he said. His voice was low and level, the words careful in the way of a man choosing each one with some precision. She waited. "The accounts from Bath," he said. "I saw them. I did not intend to, and I regret the intrusion. But I saw them, and I understand what they demonstrate." She was aware of her own heartbeat, not elevated exactly, but very present, the way a thing becomes present when it is suddenly relevant. She had left the drawer open. She would not tell him that for some time yet, because the timing of a disclosure was a thing that mattered. But she had left it open with specific deliberation on the night of the 6th of February, because she had assessed him across 3 weeks of careful watching, and had concluded that he was the kind of man who would do the right thing if the right thing were made sufficiently visible to him, and who would require no more than visibility, which was its own form of trust. "The accounts are accurate," she said. "I know they are. They demonstrate continuous management of the estate from the period in question. I know what they demonstrate, Mrs. Vane." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has revised an estimate significantly and is still engaged in processing the implications of the revision. It sat oddly alongside the composed authority that was his usual presentation, like a crack in stone that has been under pressure long enough to have its direction changed. "His Grace does not need to act on what he observed," she said. She used his title deliberately, the careful formality of it, because they were at a hinge point. and formality was the thing that kept hinge points from swinging in directions neither party had authorized. "Lord Westmere," he said very quietly, "I hold an earldom." "Forgive me," she said. "I am not correcting you as a matter of pride," he said. "I am correcting you because the use of title at this moment suggests you are maintaining a distance you do not need to maintain. Not from me. Not tonight." Cecily's hands, which were resting on the desk, did not move. Her breath, however, did something it had not consulted her about, which was to stop briefly and then resume at a different register entirely. "You know what the accounts prove," she said. "Yes. You know that Pemberton's case collapses the moment Morrow sees them." "Yes. You know that no one has asked Mrs. Petch to speak." He looked at her. "Mrs. Petch?" "She was in this study on the evening of the 4th of October, Cecily said. "She brought me a letter from my father's physician. She saw the account book open on this desk, with the bath receipts folded inside it. She is the household record of what I was doing while I was away. She has not been asked because no one imagined a housekeeper was a relevant witness." Something moved across Edmund's face that she could not entirely name, but its direction was unmistakable. It was the expression of a man who had believed he was watching a woman endure, and who had just understood that he had been watching a woman conduct. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stood at the corner of the desk, close enough that the candlelight fell equally on both of them, and looked at her in the way he had been carefully not looking at her for 6 weeks. She had known he had been carefully not looking. She had noted it in the same account book she kept for everything else that mattered. "You have had this planned," he said. "I have had the estate's welfare planned," she said. "Those are the same thing." "Not entirely," he said. His hand, which was resting on the corner of the desk, moved perhaps 2 inches toward hers and then stopped. The stopping was more weighted than the moving, somehow. It was the stopping of a man who has permitted himself 1 step in a direction and then remembered all of the reasons he had been standing still, and it communicated something that a full crossing of the distance could not have communicated in quite the same way. She let it stand. She did not move her own hand. She was aware of him with a specificity that seemed unrelated to the distance between them, which was roughly 8 inches, a measurement she could not have explained knowing with such precision, but nonetheless did. "Morrow is a fair man," he said finally. "He will not be persuaded by Pemberton's language. He will want evidence of intent." "Yes," she said. "The accounts provide it." "They do." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he straightened, which was the motion of a man reassembling himself, and said, "I will see you in the morning," in a voice that was not entirely level, and left. Cecily sat in the quiet study after the door had closed and allowed herself, in the privacy of no audience whatsoever, to breathe. She was not in love in the way the novels described love. She had already established this as a category that did not apply to her, and she saw no reason to revise the finding. What she had for him was something more precise than that, more specific, and in its specificity, more durable. She had recognized him, and he had begun to recognize her. And in the economy of the Regency period, which had so few currencies available for the exchange of real things between people, recognition was the closest approximation of the thing the novels were attempting to describe. She closed the account book. She put out the candle. She went to bed. And for the first time in 8 months, she slept through until morning without waking. The formal hearing began at 10 in the morning, with Morrow at the head of the table, his wig slightly askew in the manner of a man who wore formal dress as a professional obligation rather than a personal preference. He was 62 years old and had been in legal practice since the age of 22, and had seen precisely this type of contested estate proceeding approximately 40 times, a fact visible in the particular quality of his attention, which was thorough and entirely unimpressible. On the evening of the 14th, the night before the hearing, the corridor outside the room, Moreau's senior clerk had been given for his preparatory work produced a conversation that Cecily, passing with a candle on her way to the study, did not intend to overhear. The clerk was speaking to one of the junior men, and his voice carried with the particular confidence of someone certain of privacy. He said that it was a shame about the clever little widow, because she was well enough in her way. But these cases rarely turned out well when the blood claim was sound, and the widow's right was contested. He said that Pemberton's man from Lincoln's Inn had argued 6 similar proceedings successfully, and that Lord Westmere was a fair man, but not the sort to overturn a legal instrument on the basis of personal preference for one party. Cecily stood in the corridor with her candle and heard the end of the sentence, and then walked on. There was nothing to be gained from standing still. She had the accounts. Edmund had seen them. Mrs. Petch was prepared to speak. The plan was the plan, and a clerk's private assessment of its prospects was not evidence, and she had not spent 8 months of work on a foundation that would shift under a stranger's opinion of her odds. She went to the study and sat down and opened the account book to the Bath pages and read them again, not because she had forgotten their contents, but because the reading of them steadied her, and she was not above requiring steadying. Pemberton spoke first at the hearing, as he had been intending to from the moment he arrived at Crestfall Park in January. He was practiced and methodical. He had prepared his argument across 12 weeks, and it showed. He laid out the terms of the will's residency clause, the specific period of Cecily's Bath absence, the definition of residency as it appeared in common legal practice, and the argument that her departure during the formal mourning period, however sympathetically motivated, had constituted a technical forfeiture of the dower rights the will had specified. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes and without hesitation, and sat down with the composed satisfaction of a man who believes he has placed the final piece. Dorothea spoke briefly after him, to confirm the dates of Cecily's absence, and to add, with the dignity of genuine feeling mixed with considerable error, that she had always understood her brother to have meant for the estate to remain in family hands. She did not call Cecily the clever little widow. She said, instead, that she was certain her late brother's widow had acted in the manner she believed to be correct, and that the difficulty with the manner one believes to be correct was that it was not always the same as the manner the law required. She sat down. The clerk at the far wall made a notation. Cecily had not yet spoken. Moreau looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "Mrs. Vane, you may address the question of your residency intent." Cecily said nothing for precisely 3 seconds, which was enough time for the room to understand that she was going to speak, and that the speaking would be deliberate. "I have no additional evidence to offer this proceeding," she said. "I believe the evidence already in the room is sufficient." Pemberton shifted slightly. He was not certain what evidence she meant, because he had reviewed the documents available and found nothing that supported her case. Edmund set the account book on the table in front of Moreau. The room did not make a noise. It was not the absence of noise that rooms produce when nothing is happening. It was the specific silence of a room full of people who are all becoming aware simultaneously that something has just changed. "The estate has been managed," Edmund said. "I have the accounts." He said nothing else. He did not need to say anything else. 10 words, spoken with the level precision of a man stating a fact in front of a solicitor, and the shape of the morning was entirely different from the shape it had been 2 minutes before. Moreau opened the account book. He read in the manner of a professional reader, quickly, but without skipping. The room watched him. Pemberton watched the account book. Dorothea watched her hands. Mrs. Petch, who had been admitted as a witness for the purposes of corroboration, sat in the chair at the end of the room and kept her expression arranged into the careful neutrality she had practiced over 30 years of service, though Cecily, who was looking at her, caught the particular quality of attention in Mrs. Petch's eyes that was something very close to satisfaction. Morrow read for 14 minutes. Then he closed the account book, removed his spectacles, cleaned them with the particular deliberation of a man organizing his thoughts through the motion of his hands, and replaced them. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, "the residency clause in the will of Mr. Alastair Vane requires demonstrable intent to maintain the estate as primary residence, with allowance for reasonable absence in service of familial obligation. The accounts before me demonstrate continuous estate management from the period in question, including from the location of the contested absence, and constitute, in my judgment, sufficient evidence of intent." Pemberton said, "That interpretation of the clause requires." "My interpretation of the clause," Morrow said, with the particular quietness of a man who does not raise his voice when he wishes to be understood with absolute finality, "is the operative interpretation. Mrs. Vane's dower rights under the will are intact. The guardianship of Master Thomas Vane remains with Mrs. Vane in accordance with the will's explicit designation. This proceeding is concluded." He stacked his papers. He replaced his pen in its case. He did these things as though the matter were already historical, which was its own form of verdict. Pemberton sat very still for a moment, and then stood and collected his document case with the measured movements of a man who has rehearsed his exit for every possible outcome, and is now performing the one he did not prefer. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at the door, and then he went through it. Dorothea sat a moment longer. She looked at the account book, still open on the table, and then she looked at Cecily. And something in her expression shifted. Not apology exactly, but its near neighbor. A small adjustment in the certainty that had been holding her upright. "My brother," she began, and then did not continue the sentence, because there was no sentence available that did not require her to revise something she had believed for 8 months, and she was not yet ready to do that revision in public. "He was a good man," Cecily said, which was true, and which was also the right sentence, and Dorothea seemed to receive it in that spirit. Dorothea rose, gathered her shawl, and left without further remark. The clerks filed out. Morrow remained only long enough to exchange a few procedural words with Edmund about the filing of the judgment, and then he too was gone, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after something that has been building for a long time has finally landed. Mrs. Petch crossed to the table and retrieved the account book. She set it in front of Cecily without ceremony, in the manner of someone returning a possession to its rightful owner. "Will that be all, ma'am?" she said. "Yes," Cecily said. "Thank you, Mrs. Petch." "As you say, ma'am." Mrs. Petch left with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has done what was required and considers the rest none of her concern, which was the manner in which she had done everything for 30 years, and which was also, Cecily thought, a form of love. The room held only the two of them now, in the particular quality of silence that follows a conclusion. Edmund stood at the window, which was where he had begun the morning, though the quality of his standing there was not the same. He was looking at the park, the long grass catching the spring light in a way that made it appear almost silver, and he was not performing the careful remoteness that had been his habit for 8 months. The remoteness was still there, or its shape was, but it was the shape of a thing that has been set down rather than the shape of a thing being deployed. Cecily reached up and lifted the veil. The light in the room fell differently without it. She had grown accustomed to the slight dimming it produced, the way it rendered the world slightly muffled and separate, and the absence of it felt, for a moment, like a considerable change in atmospheric pressure. She folded it back from her face and let it rest against the brim of her bonnet, and she sat in the spring light of the hearing room and looked at the window where Edmund was standing. He turned. He looked at her face, which he had seen clearly only a handful of times in 8 weeks, and for a moment he did not say anything. His expression was not the expression of a man who has won a legal proceeding. It was the expression of a man who is looking at someone he has been attempting, for a specific and increasingly insufficient set of reasons, not to look at directly, and who has now stopped attempting it. "You knew I would find the accounts," he said. She did not answer this immediately, because the honesty of the question deserved a considered response. "I thought you might," she said at last. "I thought you were the sort of man who notices things. You did not know I would act on what I found." "No," she said. "I did not know that." That was the part that required trust. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wood pigeon called again, and somewhere on the grounds, Thomas was audible, his 9-year-old voice carrying through the open window with the particular clarity that children produce when they believe no one is listening. He was talking to his nurse about something involving a frog, and the ordinary brightness of it moved through the room like a current of warm air. "He is safe," Edmund said. "He is safe," she agreed. Edmund crossed the room, not in the decisive 3 strides of a public reversal, but in the quiet way of a man moving toward something he has decided upon without audience. And he sat down in the chair across the corner of the table from her. It was the chair Moreau had occupied. He picked up the account book and looked at it, not reading it, but holding it, and then he set it down again. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I had a specific set of expectations, and I arranged them into a conclusion before I had examined the evidence. I should like to apologize for that." "You were not wrong that I was planning something," she said. "No," he said. "I was wrong about its object." She looked at him. He looked at her. The spring light came through the Georgian sash windows and lay across the table between them, and the account book sat in it like the most ordinary object in the world, which it was, except that it was also the object around which the past 8 months had organized themselves. "The Southfield drainage," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The Southfield. I noted in August that it would require attention in spring. It has not been attended to. I would appreciate the trustee's authorization for the expenditure." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she did not think she had seen on a man's face before, or if she had, not directed at her, which was the expression of someone confronting something they had not previously understood to be a variety of joy. It was very nearly amusement, except that it was grave and warm, and entirely without the social armor that had been his habitual presentation for the months she had known him. "I will authorize it today," he said. "Thank you, Lord Westmere." "Edmund," he said. Quietly, in the manner of a door that has been latched for long enough that the opening of it does not require force, only intention. She looked at the accounts in his hands, and then at his face, and she permitted herself, in the spring light, in the empty hearing room, with Thomas's voice still carrying from the park, the expression she had been holding in reserve all morning. She had outplanned them all, which was the plan, and the plan had worked, and the estate was safe, and Thomas was safe, and Mrs. Petch would remain as she had always been, reliable and unsurprised by anything. These were the facts she had arranged across 8 months of work, and they were good facts solid and habitable, the kind one could build a life inside. That he was in them, sitting across the corner of the legal table in the spring light, looking at her as though she were something he had been attempting to categorize and had finally given up categorizing, was not a fact she had planned. It was, she thought, the better kind of fact, the kind that arrives without being arranged for. If you have stayed with Cecily this far, leave a word below about the moment that changed the room for you. There are more stories in this vein, waiting to be told. That spring, the south field at Crestfall Park was drained in the first week of April, as Cecily had recommended in August. Thomas turned 10 in May and learned, under Cecily's continued instruction, to read Latin well enough to surprise his new tutor, which pleased her immensely. Mrs. Petch remained in her position, with the permanent air of a woman who has never required vindication to know her own worth, which was a quality Cecily had long admired and continued to study, too. Edmund came back in June. He had reasons, all of them legitimate and estate-related, and Cecily had found that she valued this about him, that he was a man who required reasons, because reasons were the honest currency of the thing between them, more honest than declarations, which were available to anyone. The account book was returned to the locked drawer where it had always lived, except for the drawer's occasional failures of locking that neither of them mentioned directly. On the evening of the 3rd of June, with the long summer light still on the park, and Thomas asleep, and Mrs. Petch somewhere at the far end of the house conducting the affairs of the household with her customary unhurried thoroughness, Cecily and Edmund sat at the study table with the accounts between them and discussed the drainage report from the south field and the repairs to the east wing roof and the question of the autumn tenancy contracts and all of the practical business of a place they were, together and without formal declaration, learning to call home. He said her name, just once, in the manner of a man for whom the saying of it is not casual but chosen. She did not smile exactly. She did something quieter than that, which was to look at him and let him see it. The candle on the study table burned down to its last inch, and she did not replace it because the summer dark was warm and the window was open to the park, and there was no urgent need for more light than what they already had.